Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Soviet Union joined the Axis. The Soviet Union at the beginning of World War II was already in OTL, a temporary ally of Nazi Germany. It was in some way a surprise for the people in those years because National Socialists were anti-communists, or weren't they? One could argue that in this particular case of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazis were doing realpolitik. They were opportunistic and didn't view the Soviets as allies in that case, just temporary allies. The pact was only used to delay the eventual invasion and demise of the Soviet Union, and the Germans needed supplies, food and oil from the Soviets in order to beat Poland and later on France. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wasn't an alliance, nor did both states saw each other eye to eye. Everyone knew what the endgame was. The problem for the Soviets was that their army was relatively inexperienced and their production wasn't high enough, and Germany wouldn't be able to fight a two-front war. Getting the Soviets to join them against Poland was actually a very clever move, because the Soviets would also fight against the Poles, get their old territories back, but at the same time help the Germans to not waste too many resources. We can argue that from that perspective the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was very clever, and it didn't help the Soviets, that they were isolated in the end 20s and through the whole 30s. The Soviets, while knowing that the Germans would anyway support the Lebensraum idea, was happy enough to get some deal with them. It was convenient because the Soviets could on some smaller country put some focus, like Finland and Romania. They would be able to expand their sphere of influence without the bigger risks such as annexing the Baltic states, and last but not least, they could buy valuable time they needed. Poland was attacked by the Germans, but then the Soviets invaded as well. Poland was doomed, and the main point of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact got fulfilled. The next logical step would have been that the Soviets would join the Axis. However, this never happened, although, and this is now not an alternate history point, there were negotiations going on. Actually, there were for real talks where the Soviets put some points forward, where the Nazis put some points forward, and they were negotiating on whether to join the Axis or not. Let that sink in. So let's actually think about such a world where this unholy alliance would happen. So what if all of that changed? What if the Soviet Union joined the Axis? Let's discuss the conditions that both the Germans and the Soviets had for such an alliance. It would be a pact with the devil for both sides, and ultimately we would get a diplomacy dictated by realpolitik and not ideology. This would of course not only disillusion many hardcore Nazis and hardcore communists, but it could make them really upset. Sure, Stalin and Hitler, they had a lot of power and they could just suppress any kind of dissent easily, but the rest of the party members would eventually somehow rebel or try to forcefully remove their leaders. In order to avoid any type of internal problem, a very good and clever excuse would be needed. From the German side, the lack of resources could be mentioned, as well as dealing with the West at first. If the West wouldn't fall and the Germans would get for their plans for more Lebensraum a two-front war, then the 1,000-year Reich would barely even reach a decade. Also, Italy would still be messing around and divert the attention of Germany on several occasions. Greece. Most rational or intelligent members, despite having very ideological convictions, would accept this reasoning, and that going first after France and then the UK would be the way Indeed. The USSR would be a good partner because they could attack the Brits in other parts, where the Germans they just simply could not reach them, such as in Asia for instance. The Soviets wouldn't be all too happy about joining ranks with the Germans, but in a very twisted way. They would just help to accelerate the fall of the capitalist world, wouldn't they? In their minds, joining the Germans would strengthen them, and not only would they be able to buy some time, but they would go after easier targets at first, when the Germans would be weakened enough after beating the other big powers. Only then could the Soviets come and invade almost all of Europe. Of course, this wouldn't be said out loud, but it's what they would have in mind, the Soviet authorities I'm talking about. What do I want to say with it? This alliance would not only be very fragile, but it would have a purpose, mainly to defeat the Brits and the French and the Chinese to a lesser extent, perhaps even dealing with Turkey and Iran in some way. But we will get to Turkey a little bit later. After that, it would be a free-for-all, a battle royale. So let's just keep going. How would this alliance actually come into effect? The main point of dispute was Bulgaria. Hitler wasn't keen on giving up Bulgaria to the Soviet sphere of influence, and thus the negotiations ended because the Germans never responded. Stalin actually had a huge list of conditions, but he modified them and demanded only that the German troops would depart from Finland. Of course, he demanded also stuff from Bulgaria and claims on Iraq and Iran. The Japanese renunciation of rights to northern Sakhalin oil and coal concessions in exchange for appropriate compensation, as well as very high economic offers to Germany. Japan and other Axis members, they would also get very high economic offers. So let's just say that the Germans would agree to most of those conditions. Not from a point where they were afraid of the Soviets, but from another interesting point of view where they would just simply not care. Yeah, I mean, if the Germans are beating the West, who cares what the Soviets have later on, right? They would just deal with the Soviets afterwards. And yeah, okay, Japan would probably renounce on some rights to the northern Sakhalin oil and coal and some other little islands. But hey, Japan would get money, they would get resources, they would need that to also expand in the Pacific. And later on, when they are done with everything, the Soviets will be next, right? With that said, not only would the USSR join the Axis, but Bulgaria as well. The world would be shocked, not because Bulgaria joined the Axis, but because the USSR joined the Axis. And here we come to Turkey. The next thing that the Axis they would try to deal with would be Turkey. Getting Turkey on board, or maybe invading Turkey. One of these two options would be on the table. Perhaps in this timeline, Italy would offer the Turks some Greek islands, and with Soviet German pressure, the Turks would feel forced to accept an Axis membership. Lebanon and Syria would then become an important next step for the Axis powers, and I believe that the Turks would also actually enjoy getting back parts of Syria and Lebanon. And the Iraqi-British war would then also become a very different war, where I believe that the Soviets would have no problems helping the Iraqi forces. The Turks would also help the Iraqi forces. There would be also some Arabic troops from Lebanon and Syria, German support. The operation would be a great success, and Iraq would also join the Axis powers. Iran would then become the next target, and Cyprus as well. The Soviets, they would be able to pass through the Bosporus, and with a lot of support from the Turks, the Italians and the Germans, Cyprus too would be taken. Palestine and Sinai would be the next points of interest, and if these would be taken, I believe Spain would almost agree in joining the Axis as well. By 1942, in this alternate timeline, I believe Iran and many parts of the Middle East, Sinai and other key locations, they would be taken by the Axis. And Japan would actually fare much better in this timeline. They would not just station any troops in the borders with the Soviet Union. They would just use them to deal much quicker with China, for instance. And speaking of China, China would be dealt with also quicker in this scenario because the Soviets would just intervene in the West, and they would then establish the Uyghur or the Turkestan SSR. At this point, another invasion on the island of Britain would be unlikely due to the huge failure of the Unternehmen Seelöwe. Instead, the Nazis would use the resources from the Soviets in order to build the Atlantic Wall in a better shape, quicker and in a very efficient way. This time around, it would be almost impossible to go through the Atlantic Wall. Would Japan invade Australia? No. Japan would focus some more resources in keeping those parts that they conquered, but also by planning a joint invasion of India with the Soviets. This invasion would take some months, maybe even up to a year, but it would be largely successful due to the fact that the British Empire was disconnected. There were also issues with the supply lines and communication lines for the Soviets and the Japanese as well. But we also have to keep in mind that there were forces that wanted an independent India, and they were ready to collaborate with the Axis powers. The Japanese at this point, they would be overextended, but they would get their demands met thanks to the Soviets. Britain would then be forced to sign some type of agreement, be it the capitulation, an armistice, or even the transfer of certain territories. And even if the US were to intervene, not much could be done. Yes, the Americas would be very safe, but Europe, Asia and Africa would be out of their reach. Australia and New Zealand would basically ally themselves with the US, but after more fights, wasted lives and resources, we would get a Cold War for some time. Once the fight between the Axis powers and the West stops, it would be a waiting game. Italy would not be a very serious contender, Japan would be overextended, Germany would be way too dependent on the Soviets. And the Soviets, they could just move their factories to Siberia. They would still have a lot of manpower. They would have a huge territory. They could now produce tanks, guns, equipments, everything. They would now also possess ports in India, Iran and Iraq. And I believe with a wrong move from the Germans, the Soviets could end up not only taking most of Europe, but additional parts in Asia. Now, I'm not saying they will conquer everything, okay? But in some way, the Soviets, they would have a very easy time. Logistically, it would also be a nightmare for the Soviets to invade until Spain or Italy. So I believe that a huge chunk of the old world would fall to the Soviets, but in a very indirect way, of course. So they would invade up until certain countries, but the rest would then just have to ally themselves with the Soviets. And after the Axis Cold War would be over, we would get a Cold War somewhat similar to our timeline, but the only difference is that we have a very powerful Soviet Union. And I believe that after getting the hands over the Axis members and after beating them and after being now in this Cold War against the US, this alternate version of the Soviet Union would definitely come out on top. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.